In the closing chapters of Journey to the West, we have to understand this as the very end of a very long progression. And here the excerpts of an anthology can be particularly difficult, but when you read the full work and you get the sense of this has been going on for a very long time, and we are finally getting closer to the goal that has always been to get these sutras so that we can bring them back to to our homeland. There is a kind of lifting anticipation, a swell, a surge running underneath the text as we are being swept along to this. And the pilgrims themselves in this moment, you can see them coming closer and closer and marking a kind of progression, that they are growing more, they are passing through lands that are remarkably more pious, let's say, a kind of spiritual utopia. In the regions they passed through, every family was devoted to good works, and every household would feed the monks. That is a kind of divine neighborhood, the outskirts of heaven, if you will, at this point. And that comes in prose, and then that is matched and repeated in poetry. They met people in cultivation beneath the hills and saw travelers reciting sutras in the woods. And you see the people in cultivation, well, are they cultivating themselves, possibly, spiritually, or are they cultivating the land? Well, okay, that would make them farmers, and that would make a little sense if they are beneath the hills. You can't really farm hills all that conveniently, so flatlands work best. And so that is a sense of, okay, the local people. But then those are buttressed also with the travelers, where we can consider them probably pilgrims, not unlike these people that we have been following. And the travelers saw reciting sutras in the woods. And that is curious also, because that beneath the hills makes you think of in the flatlands, or perhaps in the town where they can all reside. And that is in contrast to in the woods where the travelers are. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but that seems to mean something. And just bearing that in mind as you go along, like, oh, okay, there's a contrast being set up there. And so as we follow along even further, that sense of the town versus the country is becoming a little bit more sharper, because as they are walking further down this path, we are told the master and disciples proceeded for some 6 or 7 days, when they suddenly caught sight of a row of tall buildings and noble lofts. They seem to be going through, essentially a nowhere, quite frankly. In the middle of nowhere, suddenly, though, this city erupts, a shining city, a divine city, a kind of mystical city. And this is the divine city that houses the Buddha, that houses their goal, their final aspiration in this journey. And the markings of this city are curious for the details they mention. We are told there are treasure arches of a spirit palace, the pearly courts and jeweled edifices, the immortal hall where the way is preached. Those specifics, a palace, courts, a hall, these are impressive, if not monumental, buildings, and the trappings of power and authority are all over them. A court, whether you think of that as a legal court or just a courtly manner of where people can hang out, a regal royal court. And the obvious parallel to this is the court where they left of the emperor at the beginning. So now you can look at this a couple of different ways. There is an almost bumper sticker quality to this, if you think in terms of, well, they left a court, the imperial court, and went on this long journey just to find themselves back in an imperial court. So maybe it's not the destination, it's the journey, which is a rather trite way of looking at it, but maybe that's one element here. Maybe it is, however, also a sense that the imperial court is all there really needs to be. We are told just a little bit later that the pilgrims had to pass through the central hall of the temple in order to go on to the ultimate destination of seeing the Buddha and achieving these sutras that they so desire. So you're getting a sense of the centrality of this court, the centrality of this palace, of this city environment in the middle of nowhere, which is the pathway to the divine, which is the portal to the divine. And so this is starting to take on some curious trappings of power, of political power, of a centralized state, an imperial state that says we are similar in all respects to the divine power as well. If there is a secular power in the East, and here we have a holy power in the West, they are equivalent. They are very, very similar. And in fact, maybe you don't even have to go on this 1,000+ mile journey, death-defying journey, adventurous journey to get to a divine space, but rather you just go through the appropriate authorities here, the imperial trappings here, which are essentially the same thing. The path to divinity runs through secular authority as well. And you can see the propagandistic value of this as we are coming along, and it's all starting to coalesce around that. You can't look at that as the only element within this. However, that is one thread woven through this tapestry. You can look at, well, all right, just the similarities or the back and forth between prose and poetry that we just outlined, where in prose we are told master and disciples proceeded for some 6 or 7 days when they suddenly caught sight of the row of tall buildings and noble lofts, and in poetry the buildings become a little bit more specific. This is a melding of the prose and the poetry, which has been going on throughout, but now the lines seem to be getting effaced even further. The shifts from one to the other seem to be disappearing. There is a melding of reality in the poetry and the prose that is suddenly not suddenly, but over time now, becoming really very continuous. So there is an aesthetic value there. And I don't want to overstate or understate the aesthetic value that is presented in the journey itself. When they finally achieve their goal, when the monk approaches the Buddha at the end of chapter 98, you get, or in the middle of chapter 98 to be perfectly honest, you get this beautiful moment that is really quite astounding. The 4 pilgrims, on reaching the great hero treasure hall, prostrated themselves before Tathagata. Thereafter they bowed to all the attendants of Buddha on the left and the right. This they repeated 3 times before kneeling again before the Buddha Patriarch to present their traveling rescript to them. After reading it carefully, Tathagata handed it back to Tripitaka, who touched his head to the ground once more to say, "By the decree of the great Tang Emperor in the land of the East, your disciple Xuanzang has come to this treasure monastery to beg you for the true scriptures for the redemption of the multitude. I implore the Buddhist Patriarch to vouchsafe his grace and grant me my wish so that I may soon return to my country." And this is beautiful. This is an act of pious devotion. And you can see the ritualistic approach that he has, and the handing of the document, the touching of his head, the bowing, all of this is very sincere. We can sense the devoutness of it. And we know that this comes after a long, long struggle. He has been journeying so far for so long to do exactly this. So this moment is a climactic moment for him. He is stepping up there and opening his heart, honestly imploring this divine figure to help him get, or semi-divine figure, to help him attain this little touch of divinity himself. this scriptural text that will show him the pathway to God. And that is beautiful. And you can't deny that. You can't ignore that. You have to make room for, okay, this can be, let's say, an argument for centralized government, if you will, and a consolidation of power in a vastly disparate empire. Yeah, you can make that argument. You can see that evidence, and you can appreciate that power within the text. But at the same time, you can't ignore there are aesthetic values going on here too. There are very human values going on here too. This monk is opening his heart, and he is just presenting it in all sincerity to this figure in a kind of devotional apex. And there is something quite astoundingly beautiful in that. But that passage of pious devotion is followed immediately by this blistering critique by the Buddha figure here. To express the compassion of his heart, Tathagata opened his mouth of mercy and said to Tripitaka, "Your land of the east belongs to the South Jambudvipa continent. Because of your size and fertile land, your prosperity and population, there is a great deal of greed and killing, lust and lying, oppression and deceit. People neither honor the teachings of Buddha nor cultivate virtuous karma. They neither revere the three lights nor respect the 5 grains. They are disloyal and unfilial, unrighteous and unkind, unscrupulous and self-deceiving. Through all manners of injustice and taking of lives, they have committed boundless transgressions." And then it gets worse for quite a while after that. He is just dumping all over the monk. And you gotta feel for him. This is kind of a crushing blow. We were all with him as he stepped up and begged this figure to fulfill his fondest wish. And now this figure is just taking a hammer to him again and again and again and saying, "No, you people suck." And on the one hand, that is kind of funny, quite frankly. That sincerity met with such a crushing blow is a little funny because it's so jarring. But it's also a sign of, I think, the clashing perspectives at play here. We are forced to admit that, well, the divine perspective is going to be very different from the human perspective. And we might see Tripitaka as something more than human at this point. He is a very devout monk. He has lots of quirks, as we have all seen, but he is very sincere in this moment, so he shouldn't be lumped in with all the other human beings, perhaps. But the divine perspective doesn't necessarily see it that way. And so there is this clash of perspectives which we are forced to appreciate and say, well, okay, there's some distinctions here. The general view of the universal figure is going to be very different than that very particularized view of the human figure. And these two realms don't necessarily ever agree. And so we need to take that into some perspective. And there's also the contrast between the religious authority and the earthly authority, between the spirit and the mundane, the immaterial and the material. All of these conflicts are coming out in this little moment. And we as readers, at this critical moment of having ingested this story for so long and perhaps been swept up in the divine realm of it to the point where we think that it is ushering us into a kind of spiritual enlightenment, maybe we need to step back and be reminded that, oh no, we are still all just clods. But also the conspicuousness of what is going on here, because we see in that passage of Zhuangzang's approach, he is so dwelling on his actions and his words, his performance, his public, observable, objective behavior. he seems very sincere in that moment. He seems to be going through all the ritual actions of righteousness. And yet, the divine figure, the divine perspective says, well, no, the acts aren't necessarily enough. Or we can see that and say, well, no, the acts are what he has done. He has acted so appropriately so far. Why isn't that enough? And that, again, that emphasizes the clash, the conflict, the differences of perspective between the personal and the social, let's say, between what we can see and what we might believe. There is this gap, this aporia between them. And on a strictly literal level of language, you look at it, there's some curious oddities going on in the languages here. And obviously, language is always a problem in translation, but I think we can look at some of the basic structures of how this is laid out rhetorically. Look at the triples that are used here. Because of your size and for your prosperity and your possibilities, a great deal of greed and killing, lust and lying, oppression and deceit. So that's 6, but they are really 3 pairs. That hammering down of 3 pairs of faults of humanity broadly. And that is repeated a little bit later, saying they are disloyal and unfilial, unrighteous and unkind, unscrupulous and self-deceiving. Another curiously tripled pairing or paired tripling of insults, quite frankly. Of flaws in mankind, or at least in the people of China, that he is getting a little twist on. And you can go off on that and saying, well, is this the Chinese author, getting a little self-criticism of his own society going? I don't know. As opposed to the divine realm of the West, of India, that might be. But again, on this level of just the language structures, you have those two which are obviously matching in their rhetorical structure, and in the middle, right between them, you have people neither honor the teachings of Buddha nor cultivate virtuous karma. They neither revere the 3 lights nor respect the 5 grains. And that's working on a kind of a doubling structure where they don't do this or this, and they don't do this or this. Okay. But this is also, curiously, a specific reference to Buddhist principles, which sticks out when put in immediate relief to these other more general flaws, the other crimes that humanity here is being, or at least China here is being accused of, are much more general. They have nothing really to do with Buddhism. So the fact that one element being voiced by a Buddhist who would presumably consider everything within a Buddhist frame, the Buddhist transgression seems to be very isolated and specific versus these others, which are all over the place. And I think that is a call for some attention too, because when you look at the non-specifically Buddhist transgressions, they are all very social. They are all very societal. Greed and killing, you need other people to be involved in order to commit the sins of greed and killing. Lust and lying, yeah, same thing again. Oppression and deceit, yeah, you need a direct object for that. You need somebody to oppress or deceive. And the same thing down below. To be disloyal and unfilial, well, that's a relationship right there. Unrighteous and unkind. Arguably, yeah, you got to be unkind to someone, so it is a relationship. Unrighteous is a little bit fuzzier on that, but again, I'm making some room for some translation issues. And then unscrupulous and self-deceiving. There we're getting a little fuzzy again, but still, these are all generalized crimes against your fellow man. Social crimes, as opposed to the specifically religious Buddhist ones that are sort of couched in the middle of this diatribe. And that gets me thinking about, well, what is the bigger crime here? What is more offensive? The fact that they do not practice specific Buddhist rituals about all of these other elements that if I were a devout Buddhist or a scholar of Buddhism particularly, I might be able to go off on for a while. But I don't really care about. So those are, just oddities that I'll take for granted. That, okay, those are Buddhist sins, but everything else seems to be going after it on a much more secular social basis. And now we're back to the question of society. And which is the greater concern? The particularized religious crimes, or the more generalized, universalized social crimes? What is this journey to the West, journey to enlightenment really after? What is the ultimate goal? Is it a kind of individualized spiritual enlightenment, or a more universalized social structure lifting itself up out of division? These questions can go on forever. They are essentially unanswerable. But that mechanism of conflict, that mechanism of shifting gears within a text, just pushes you back from it. It makes all of those little quirks more conspicuous, and you have to think about them more. You have to objectify them more. You have to see all the individual threads woven into the tapestry, and then you take in the tapestry as a whole. It is an enormously complex work and an enormously complex philosophical system that we're dealing with here. So there's a lot to comb through, but on the broadest end of it, we can see that this is a negotiation between the individual and the society. Private, spiritual, individualized beliefs, the particular, and the broader, universalized beliefs of society.